The tun laughed at the Duke of Ashbourne's new wife before the soup had cooled. She had been bought with a settlement, dressed in silk that did not flatter her, and seated beneath chandeliers bright enough to expose every plain line of her face. By the end of that dinner, the same room would learn why a quiet woman was the most dangerous creature in England. This is a story of broken vows, stolen dignity, and a woman who refused to remain ornamental. The March wind came through the carriage seams like a knife drawn slowly across skin, carrying the smell of wet wool, cold iron, and road mud. Elinor Vale sat with her gloved hands folded over a gown of dove-grey silk that had been chosen for her by a maid who had never met her, and paid for by a man who had not troubled himself to ask her preference. The bodice pinched beneath her ribs. The pearls at her throat felt less like jewels than a polite collar. Across from her, her aunt slept with her mouth set in a line of exhausted triumph. Lady Beatrice Vale had given the world the appearance of sacrifice for so long that even her fatigue seemed arranged. In the pocket beside her lay the marriage contract, creased from being read too often and signed too quickly. You must remember. Her aunt had told her that morning, while fastening Elinor's veil with fingers that smelled faintly of vinegar and lavender water. A duke does not marry a woman like you for romance. He marries her because the terms are useful. Gratitude will serve you better than pride. Elinor had not answered then. She did not answer now. Beyond the glass, Ashbourne Hall appeared through the rain. A great stone house crouched against the blackening fields, its windows lit gold, its chimneys breathing smoke into the low sky. It was not beautiful in any gentle way. It looked old, rich and watchful, as if generations of Ashbourne women had pressed their palms against those panes and left warnings no servant could polish away. The carriage wheels struck gravel. Somewhere beyond the sweep of drive, a dog barked once and was silenced. The footman opened the door, and the scent of damp leaves and horse sweat rushed in. Elinor stepped down without assistance. Her slipper sank at once into mud. A line of servants waited beneath the portico. Not one smiled. Their black coats and white aprons stood sharp against the stone, but their eyes moved over her with that quick, measuring pity reserved for unfashionable brides and condemned prisoners. At the top of the steps stood her husband, Alistair Blackwood, Duke of Ashbourne, wore evening black as if mourning were his natural colour. He was tall, spare, and pale from candlelight, with a face too controlled to be called handsome by any woman who valued warmth. His dark hair showed one silver thread at the temple. His mouth looked as though it had forgotten laughter and found discipline a fair substitute. Beside him stood a woman in garnet silk. Lady Selene March did not need introduction. Her beauty performed the office for her. She had amber hair arranged in shining coils, a throat like carved ivory, and the easy posture of a woman accustomed to being watched by wives and forgiven by husbands. A ruby clasp glittered at her breast, red as a sealed wound. The Duke descended 2 steps. Not all the way. Mrs. Blackwood, he said. Not Elinor, not my wife, not Duchess. The servants heard it, Lady Selene heard it. Elinor heard the tiny snap of the trap closing. Your Grace, Elinor replied, and gave him the curtsy she had practiced until her knees ached, his gaze lowered to the mud on her hem. The roads were poor, so I discovered, Your Grace. A faint smile touched Lady Selene's mouth. How brave of you to travel in such weather. Many ladies would have postponed the journey. Many ladies had the luxury, Elinor said. Her aunt stirred inside the carriage with a soft gasp, but the Duke's expression did not change. Lady Selene's smile remained. Ashbourne Hall can be overwhelming at first, particularly for those unaccustomed to such houses. Elinor looked beyond her, into the blazing entrance hall, where marble floors reflected candle flames and footmen stood like statues beneath ancestral portraits. Every frame contained a Blackwood face. Severe men, powdered women, children painted with obedient hands and hollow eyes. A house did not become this quiet by accident. I have found, Elinor said, that houses are less difficult than people. For the first time, the Duke looked directly at her, not kindly, not with interest, as one might look at a book misfiled upon a shelf. Lady Beatrice was helped down, fluttering and shivering, already thanking everyone before anyone had shown her courtesy. The luggage was taken. The veil was removed. Wet cloak, gloves, bonnet, all were passed from hand to hand, until Elinor stood in the hall as if stripped before judgment. From somewhere above came the faintest sound. A child's cough. Elinor lifted her eyes toward the gallery. A small figure in a white nightgown vanished behind the balustrade so quickly that only the pale flash of a cheek remained. "Henrietta," the Duke said, without turning. His voice changed by no more than a shade, but the hall seemed to stiffen around it. "Return to your room." There was a pause. Then small feet retreated over the boards above. Lady Selene sighed softly. "The poor dear has had another of her difficult evenings. Children are so susceptible to household changes." Elinor looked at the empty gallery. "Your daughter?" she asked. "My daughter," the Duke said. "Not our daughter. Of course not." Nothing in the contract had mentioned a child watching from the shadows or a dead Duchess, whose portrait had been removed from the main stair, or the way every servant lowered his eyes when the name Henrietta was spoken. The butler announced that the guests had already assembled in the drawing room. Guests. On her wedding night. Elinor felt her aunt's hand clutch her sleeve in warning, but it was too late to retreat. She understood then that she had not been brought to a home. She had been delivered to a performance. The Duke offered his arm because manners required it. His sleeve was fine wool beneath her fingertips, warm from the fire, yet there was no warmth in the man. Lady Selene moved ahead of them, as if she had always known the path and expected Elinor to follow. The drawing room smelled of beeswax, orange peel, wet feathers, and expensive malice. Faces turned. A countess with a fan paused mid-flutter. A baron laughed into his wine before disguising it as a cough. Two young ladies whispered behind lace, their eyes bright with the pleasure of seeing another woman placed beneath them. Silk rustled. Jewels winked. The fire cracked in the grate as if impatient for the first insult. "Your Grace," someone said to the Duke, "we had begun to fear you had misplaced your bride upon the road." "Impossible," Lady Selene replied before he could speak. "One could not misplace such a sensible gown." Laughter moved through the room, light and quick as thrown pins. Elinor stood still. The Duke did not defend her. He did not even glance down. A servant passed with champagne. Lady Selene took a glass and drifted near enough for the ruby at her throat to catch the firelight. "How fortunate you are, Mrs. Blackwood," she murmured, clear enough for the nearest guests to hear. "Most plain women are granted invisibility. You have been given a title instead." The laughter came louder this time. Elinor's aunt looked at the carpet. The Duke looked at the mantel clock. The room waited for a blush, a tear, a trembling retreat. Elinor lifted one hand and removed a speck of dried mud from her glove. "I shall endeavour to deserve the inconvenience," she said. The laughter faltered, not because the insult had failed, but because no one could decide whether she had meant to cut back. Lady Selene's eyes narrowed by the smallest degree. Then the dinner bell rang. That sound, clear and silver, should have summoned the inevitable humiliation. A plain bride at a glittering table, a mistress at her husband's side, and a house eager to teach its new Duchess where she belonged. But the inevitable morning never came. As the guests began to move, Elinor saw the child again. Henrietta stood half-hidden behind the drawing-room door, barefoot on the cold marble, clutching something torn and blue in her fist. Her face was thin, her dark eyes too large, her hair unevenly brushed, as if no loving hand had bothered with it. When Lady Selene noticed her, the girl flinched before a word had been spoken. That flinch told Elinor more than any account book could have done. The Duke turned. "Henrietta, I gave an instruction." The child swallowed. "I only wanted to see her." Lady Selene crossed the room with a soft swish of silk. "Darling, this is not the hour." Henrietta stepped back. Elinor moved before she had weighed the wisdom of it. She went to the child, slowly enough not to frighten her, and knelt in the doorway despite the mud on her hem and the watching faces behind her. "What have you there?" Elinor asked. The girl opened her fist. A torn blue ribbon lay across her palm, frayed and stained with something darker than dust. It was Mama's, Henrietta whispered. They said I mustn't keep it. The room behind Elinor had gone still. For the first time since she had arrived at Ashbourne Hall, Elinor felt the shape of the true story beneath the false one. A dead Duchess no one mentioned. A child kept from dinner. A mistress who ruled the servants. A duke who had married a woman he meant to ignore. Elinor closed the child's fingers gently over the ribbon. Then we shall keep it safely, she said. Lady Selene's voice came soft as cream and cold as cellar stone. How touching. The new Duchess has found her first charity case. Elinor rose. She did not curtsy, not this time. The dining room glittered as though cruelty required candlelight to become respectable. Silver branched across the long table in polished arms, holding flames that trembled whenever a servant passed. The air was thick with roasted pheasant, hot butter, beeswax, and the faint medicinal bitterness of the orange peel steeped in the claret bowl. Elinor took the chair assigned to her at the Duke's right hand, though Lady Selene settled at his left with the ease of a woman who had chosen both the place and the insult. The guests arranged themselves like jurors. Ashbourne sat at the head of the table, his face cut into stillness. He had spoken no word after Elinor rose from Henrietta's side. That silence had followed them from the drawing room to dinner, cold as a hand laid upon the back of her neck. A footman unfolded Elinor's napkin. The linen brushed her lap, stiff with starch. Beneath the table, the mud at her hem had dried into a brittle crust. Lady Selene lifted her glass. To the new Duchess of Ashbourne. The word Duchess passed her lips as if it tasted unpleasant. Glasses rose. Some mouths smiled. Others hid behind crystal. To her Grace, murmured a viscountess whose diamonds shook with suppressed laughter. Elinor inclined her head. You are kind. Oh, kindness is the first duty of old friends, Lady Selene said. Is it not, Ashbourne? The Duke cut into his soup without looking at either woman. Quite, one word. Smaller than a coin. Worth less. No one came to save her. The first course had hardly been cleared when Lord Pemberton, red-faced from wine, leaned forward. I confess, Your Grace, none of us expected the match to be so swift. London heard of the contract before it heard of the courtship. There was no courtship, Ashbourne said. The table paused. Elinor's fingers tightened once around her spoon, then released. Lady Selene laughed softly. How honest you are. It is refreshing. Some marriages are built on poetry, others on paper. Paper lasts longer. Elinor said for a breath. The Duke's knife stopped against the plate. Lady Selene's gaze slid to her. Does it? How fortunate. Then you must be very secure indeed. Every person at that table understood what she meant. Elinor's father's debts had been paid by the marriage settlement. Under the law, once the vows were spoken, nearly everything a wife possessed belonged to her husband, unless trustees had locked it safely away for her separate use. Elinor had no such careful trustees. Her dowry had crossed into Ashbourne hands like water poured into dark soil. She owned her wedding ring and very little else. A servant approached the Duke with a small salver. Upon it lay a sealed letter, the wax stamped black. Ashbourne broke the seal with his thumb, read 3 lines, and folded it again. The paper vanished into his coat, but not before Elinor saw one phrase written in a clerk's sharp hand. Second payment due. Lady Selene saw Elinor see it. Her smile sharpened. Your Grace, said Lady Selene, turning her voice bright for the table. You must allow me to say what everyone is too polite to say. Must I? Elinor asked. Indeed, you have admirable courage. Many women would shrink from entering a room where every eye sought beauty and found instead. She paused, as if searching for mercy and discovering none. A governess in borrowed silk. The laughter came at once. It rolled down the table, not loud enough to be vulgar, not soft enough to be forgiven. A gentleman coughed into his napkin. One lady pressed her fan to her lips until her shoulders shook. Lord Pemberton looked at Ashbourne, waiting for the Duke to end it. Ashbourne lifted his wine. He drank. The silence after his swallow was worse than the laughter. Elinor looked at the man whose name she now carried. He did not meet her eyes. The candlelight showed the clean line of his jaw, the white scar near his knuckle, the wedding band already sitting on his hand as if it had been there for years and meant nothing. Lady Selene leaned back, victorious before dessert. Elinor placed her spoon neatly beside the bowl. "A governess," she said, "is generally useful. Borrowed silk may yet be returned. I shall try not to grieve over either charge." The laughter thinned. A few guests glanced down. Someone's fork clicked too sharply against porcelain. Ashbourne looked at her then, not with tenderness, not with apology, with surprise, faint and unwelcome. Lady Selene's fingers closed around the stem of her glass. Dinner continued. But the room had changed by a finger's width. Elinor had not won. She had not even defended herself enough to be safe. Yet she had learned the shape of the battlefield. Lady Selene wanted her ridiculous. The guests wanted sport. Ashbourne wanted silence. And somewhere above them, a child had learned to flinch before a woman smiled. Hours later, when the house had sunk into its night noises, the settling beams, the distant clink of banked coal, the rain scratching at the glass, Elinor stood alone in her chamber, unpinning the pearls from her throat. A married woman's room, they had called it. The bed was vast. The sheets smelled of lavender and storage, as if no bride had been expected to warm them. Then the door opened without a knock. Henrietta slipped inside in her white nightgown, barefoot, trembling with cold. In one fist, she held the torn blue ribbon. Elinor turned from the mirror. The child's eyes filled with a knowledge no 7-year-old should have carried. They laughed. "At Mamma too," Henrietta whispered. Henrietta's bare feet left small, damp marks upon the carpet, each print fading almost as soon as it appeared. Elinor crossed the chamber and shut the door with care, turning the key only after she had listened to the corridor. The child stood by the hearth, the torn blue ribbon crushed in her fist, her shoulders lifted as though she expected a blow from the air itself. The fire had burned low. Its coals gave off a red, watchful glow, and the room smelled of lavender sheets, cooling wax, and rain trapped in old stone. "Nearer," Elinor said softly. "Your feet are frozen." Henrietta obeyed in 3 careful steps. At 7 years old, she had already learned the movements of a guest in her own home. Elinor took the hearth rug from beside the grate and wrapped it around the child's feet. "Who told you that you must not keep your mamma's ribbon?" Henrietta looked down at the blue scrap. "Mrs. Pike said it made me troublesome." "Mrs. Pike is your nurse." She was. "Now she minds the linen and me when Lady Selene remembers." The child glanced toward the door. "I'm not to call her Lady Selene when Papa is near. I'm to say dear Lady March." Elinor crouched before her. "And when your father is not near?" Henrietta's fingers tightened so hard around the ribbon that her knuckles whitened. A sound passed in the next room. Not the house settling, not the rain. A slow creak of boards beyond the wall, as if someone had paused outside the adjoining door. Elinor rose and went to it. The brass handle did not move under her hand, but a thin line of light showed beneath the threshold, then vanished. Whoever had stood there had taken the candle away. Henrietta whispered. "They listen." The child had learned to be afraid of walls. Elinor returned to her and kept her voice low. "Who listens?" "Maids. Sometimes Mr. Vale, the steward. He says little girls who tell tales fall ill." Elinor remembered the sealed letter at dinner. The clerk's phrase. The second payment due. Money moved through this house in currents she had not yet seen, and a child sat in the middle of them like a dropped pin on a dark floor. "Have you been ill?" she asked. Henrietta nodded. "Only when I cried too long. Mrs. Pike put bitter drops in milk. It made my tongue heavy." Elinor's stomach turned, though her hands stayed steady as she loosened the ribbon from the child's fist. Bitter drops. Many nurseries kept laudanum locked in cupboards, and careless nurses used it to quiet children, as if a child's grief were a cough to be dosed away. "Did your father know?" Henrietta's mouth trembled, but she pressed it flat before it could betray her. "Papa does not come to the nursery." A knock struck the door. Elinor tucked the ribbon into her sleeve. "Who is there?" "Mrs. Pike, your grace." The woman's voice came through the wood, dry and offended. "Her little ladyship has wandered again. She's apt to these fancies. I'll take her." Henrietta's hand shot out and caught Elinor's skirt. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a silent grip at the grey silk, as if cloth were stronger than rank. Elinor unlocked the door. and opened it only a hand's width. Mrs. Pike stood in the corridor with a candle, her cap crooked, her eyes too sharp for a woman roused from sleep. Behind her, a maid hovered with a shawl and the expression of one eager to carry tales downstairs. "Her ladyship came to me," Elinor said. Mrs. Pike's gaze slid past her. "She is a fretful child, Your Grace. The late Duchess indulged her. We have tried to improve her habits. By leaving her barefoot at midnight?" Colour rose along the nurse's neck. "She won't keep slippers on." "I shall see that she does. That is not necessary." Elinor opened the door wider. The candlelight caught the pearls still lying upon her dressing table. The Duke's house crest pressed into the wax of every fresh taper, the new authority no servant yet wished to acknowledge. "I decide what is necessary in my chamber," Elinor said. Mrs. Pike's mouth closed. A small victory, a dangerous one. After the woman retreated, Elinor did not sleep. She kept Henrietta in the chair near the hearth until the child's head drooped, then rang for warm water herself rather than trust the corridor. At dawn, when the sky turned the colour of pewter, Elinor sent for the nursery maid and asked for Henrietta's things to be brought down. A cracked porcelain doll arrived with them. Its painted face was worn at the nose, one eye darker than the other. The gown had been ripped beneath the arm and stitched badly with black thread. Henrietta held it out with apology already in her posture. "She was Mamma's," she said. "I tore her when I hid her." Elinor took the doll into her lap. "Then we shall mend her properly." By the window, with pale morning pressing against the glass, Elinor threaded a needle and unpicked the ugly black stitches. The fabric was older than it looked, fine muslin lined with something stiff. Her needle struck paper she stilled. Inside the doll's dress, tucked between lining and seam, lay a folded note no larger than a prayer card. Elinor drew it free. The handwriting across the front was delicate, slanted, and unmistakably titled by grief. "For my Henrietta, if no one hears her." The note smelled faintly of camphor, old muslin, and the stale sweetness of a nursery cupboard, long kept shut. Elinor held it between finger and thumb, while Henrietta watched from the window seat, her small hands buried beneath the mended doll, as though the porcelain creature might be taken again. The paper had yellowed at the folds. A woman had written upon it in a hurried but elegant hand. The ink thinned where tears or damp had touched it. "For my Henrietta, if no one hears her." Elinor unfolded the note. "My darling girl, if this has been found, then I failed to speak loudly enough while I still had breath. Do not trust the bitter milk. Do not sign away my blue book. Ask for Mr. Anstruther of Lincoln's Inn. The nursery accounts will tell what polite mouths will not." At the bottom, the late Duchess had signed only her Christian name, Marianne. Henrietta whispered, "Mamma wrote it." Elinor's thumb rested near the name, careful not to smudge ink that had survived grief and concealment. "Yes, she hid things," Henrietta said. Mrs. Pike said Mamma became fanciful near the end. Lady Selene said ladies who are too delicate often mistake dreams for truth. "Did your Mamma keep a blue book?" Henrietta's brow pinched. There was a green one. In the nursery press. The blue one was gone after Mamma slept all day. Elinor folded the note along its old creases. "Then we shall begin with the green one." The nursery stood at the far end of the east passage, where the house grew colder and the carpets thinner. The walls smelled of chalk, soot, boiled linen, and the sour ghost of medicine. A rocking horse stood in the corner with one painted eye scratched away. On the mantel, a row of little china animals faced the wall, as if punished. Mrs. Pike was not there. Their absence felt arranged. Elinor opened the tall press herself. Sheets, blankets, a cracked warming pan, old pinafores tied in bundles. Beneath them lay a leather-bound account book, green once, now darkened by handling. Dust clung to its spine, but the lock had been recently scratched. Someone had looked for it. Henrietta stood behind Elinor's skirt. "Are we stealing?" "No," Elinor said. "We are reading." A door shut somewhere down the passage. Both of them stilled. Footsteps passed slowly beyond the nursery, paused, then moved on. Elinor waited until the sound faded before she opened the book on the schoolroom table. Columns marched across the pages with old-fashioned discipline. Coal, candles, linen, soap, barley sugar, physic nurses' wages. Every expense had been marked in pounds, shillings and pence, for great houses kept accounts even for a child's peppermint drops. At Ashbourne, even mercy had required an entry. The first pages seemed harmless. Then the dates changed. Elinor's eye caught the month of October 2 years past, after the late Duchess had died. Milk cordial for Lady Henrietta, laudanum draught, nursery, private carriage to Bath. By order of her Grace, Elinor turned back. Marianne had been dead before that entry was made. Her finger moved down another page. Settlement of nurse's discretion. Paid in cash, no receipt. Her Grace's private instruction. The dead had been made to pay. Henrietta leaned forward. What does it say? Elinor closed the book halfway, enough to shield the child from the ugliness of adult theft. It says your mama wished someone to look carefully. Another paper lay tucked loose between the pages, unopened, the seal broken, but the folds uncut. It had been addressed to Mr. Anstruther of Lincoln's Inn and never sent, a solicitor. The same name from Marianne's warning. Elinor opened it. Sir, should anything befall me, I beg you to examine the nursery disbursements and the steward's private vouchers. Funds assigned for my daughter's care have been diverted. I fear my husband is being misled, and I fear more for Henrietta than for myself. No signature completed the letter. The final line stopped in a drag of ink, as though the pen had been taken from her hand. Elinor tucked the letter into her sleeve beside the note, and turned page after page faster now, searching for the shape of the crime. The entries swelled after Marianne's death, medicine bought but never delivered. New gowns charged for a child still wearing mended muslin. Coal ordered for the nursery, while Henrietta slept beneath thin blankets. Charitable payments made from the late Duchess's allowance to widows and tenants, then marked as settled, though no tenant had signed a receipt. At the bottom of each false voucher appeared initials written in a narrow, elegant hand, not the steward's blunt mark, not Mrs. Pike's crooked one. Again and again, beside the largest payments, the same two letters glittered like a knife point in ink, SM. The estate mud did not care that Elinor was a duchess. It climbed her hem in dark, sucking patches before the stable yard had even disappeared behind her. And by the time the little bay mare reached the first tenant lane, cold damp had crept through Elinor's half-boots and settled against her toes. The air smelled of thawing earth, sheep dung, wood smoke, and the sharp green bite of hedgerows cut too late in the season. Ashbourne rode with gentlemen that morning, hounds baying over the north fields. Lady Selene had filled the morning room with callers, chocolate, and laughter sharp enough to reach the servants' hall. Elinor chose the lower road instead, with Marianne's note in her pocket, the green nursery book wrapped beneath her cloak, and ink already staining the tips of 2 fingers. The land told the truth before any person did. At the first cottage, the thatch sagged where rain had eaten through. At the second, a child with a cough sat on the step, wrapped in a man's coat. At the third, the door opened only after Elinor gave her name twice. A woman with red hands and hollow cheeks stared at her from the threshold. "Your Grace?" "Yes." The woman dropped a curtsy so low she nearly lost her balance. Elinor reached out, steadying her by the elbow. "Please do not. I have come to ask about the rents." The woman's eyes darted past Elinor toward the lane. "Mr. Vale keeps the rents. So the books say." That was enough. The woman's mouth closed. Inside, the cottage was warmer than the lane, but poorer than it ought to have been. Steam rose from a pot that smelled mostly of turnip. A patched shawl hung near the fire. On the table lay a rent receipt, folded under a cracked cup. Elinor asked, "May I see it?" The woman hesitated, then slid it across. The receipt showed 12 shillings paid. The Ashbourne rent roll showed 8. Elinor kept her face still and copied both figures into her small memorandum book. In many estates, rents were collected on quarter days, and ledgers were ruled so neatly that a dishonest hand could hide in plain arithmetic. Lady Day, Midsummer, Michaelmas, Christmas. The old calendar could bless a steward 4 times a year if no mistress of the house bothered to count. "Has this happened before?" Elinor asked. The woman wiped both hands on her apron. "My husband says no good comes of speaking." "Who told him that?" "A horse struck stone outside." not passing. Stopping, the woman froze. Elinor heard a man dismount beyond the door, then the scrape of a boot turning away before any knock came. A moment later, hooves retreated down the lane. On the table, beneath the cracked cup, the folded receipt trembled in the woman's hand. "Mr. Vale?" Elinor asked. "No, Your Grace." The woman would say no more. By noon, Elinor had visited 6 cottages, the dairy, and the old almshouse Marianne had endowed before her death. At every door she found another small wound, coal charged but not delivered, linen paid for but never seen, medicine ordered from the apothecary and replaced with cheap bitters. A widow showed Elinor a charity voucher bearing Marianne's seal. Though the widow had received only half the promised sum, she was good to us. The old Duchess, the widow said, rubbing her thumb over the worn paper. After she died, the goodness became dearer. Elinor looked at the columns in her book. The house was not merely unkind. It was being fed upon. When she returned through the servants' entrance at dusk, her gown was spattered to the knee, and her fingers were black with ink. A footman stared, then looked away too late. From the morning room came Selene's voice, sweet and bright. "Her Grace has discovered the rustic air. How wholesome!" Elinor did not stop. In the estate office, she found Mr. Vale bent over the great rent ledger. He rose quickly, blocking the open page with his sleeve. "Your Grace." "His Grace does not trouble ladies with such matters." "Then His Grace has been spared a great deal of trouble." The steward's smile did not reach his eyes. "Country people complain. It is their nature. It is also their nature to starve when robbed." His face hardened. "Careful, madam." Elinor stepped closer and laid one copied receipt upon the desk. "No, you will be careful." For a moment, only the clock spoke. Tick, tick, tick. Then a maid appeared at the door, breathless. "Your Grace, Mrs. Bell at Eastmere sent for you. Her husband says she won't see morning." Elinor took her cloak again. Mrs. Bell's cottage smelled of tallow, fever sweat, and rosemary burned to sweeten the air. The dying woman lay propped on pillows, her breath rattling beneath a linen cap. Her husband stood by the hearth, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. Mrs. Bell beckoned. Elinor bent low. "A man came," the woman whispered. "Said if Tom spoke of the rent, he'd be turned out before lambing." Her fingers opened. A silver button lay in her palm, stamped with the Ashbourne crest. He dropped this. Elinor lifted it, cold metal, ducal arms, 3 black birds beneath a crown, her own husband's livery. The silver button lay in Elinor's reticule, like a tooth pulled from a wolf. All the next morning she felt its weight against her wrist, while Ashbourne Hall prepared itself for another evening of elegant cruelty. Footmen carried trays of polished glass. Maids beat dust from curtains in the cold courtyard. In the drawing room, Lady Selene arranged roses in a porcelain bowl, and spoke of London as if scandal were merely a weather pattern one might enjoy from a warm window. Elinor returned from the estate office with more copied figures hidden beneath her shawl and found a folded paper waiting upon her dressing table. No servant admitted leaving it. The seal was plain. No crest, no name. Inside, in a cramped hand, were only 6 words: "Ask where the pearls have gone." Elinor read it twice, then held it over the candle until the edges browned. She did not burn it. She folded it and placed it beside Marianne's note, the unfinished letter to Mr. Anstruther, and the list of false rents. Warnings were not the same as proof, but in Ashbourne Hall, warnings had begun to arrive like ravens. At dinner, the guests were fewer than before, which made their attention sharper. Lord Pemberton had returned. So had the Viscountess with the shaking diamonds. Ashbourne sat at the head of the table, weary from a day in the fields, while Selene glittered beside him in cream satin, a string of pearls at her throat, not old pearls. New ones. Elinor noticed their colour, too white, too even, too recently purchased. The second course had just been removed when Mrs. Pike entered without being announced. Her cap was properly pinned, but her breathing came fast, as if she had rehearsed alarm and found it suited her. "Your Grace," she said to the Duke, "I beg pardon. There has been a discovery." Ashbourne set down his glass. "What discovery?" Mrs. Pike clasped her hands. "The late Duchess's pearl coronet is missing from the jewel press." The table went silent with pleasure. Elinor felt the room inhale. Lady Selene pressed a hand to her breast. Marianne's coronet? But it was to be kept for Henrietta. So I believed, my lady, Mrs. Pike said, and lowered her eyes exactly one beat too late. Ashbourne's gaze moved to Elinor. Have you had the jewel press opened? No, Elinor said. Selene's voice trembled just enough to appear generous. Ashbourne, perhaps it is a mistake. Her Grace may not have understood the value of the piece. Lord Pemberton cleared his throat. Pearls of that age, if matched, would fetch a handsome sum. They would fetch a charge of theft if pledged by the wrong hands, Ashbourne said. A pawned jewel was not easily hidden in England. Pawnbrokers kept pledge books, recording names, goods, and sums advanced, and a lady's coronet could not pass through such hands without leaving ink behind. Whoever had laid this trap trusted that shame would do its work before any ledger could. Elinor placed both hands in her lap, one over the reticule that held the silver button. Selene looked across the table with soft triumph. No one wishes to embarrass you, dear Elinor. A lie could wear perfume. I have already been embarrassed, Elinor answered. The question is whether Ashbourne Hall intends to become honest. A spoon clattered somewhere down the table. Ashbourne rose. His chair scraped the floor, hard and final. You will speak with care in this house. I have begun to. His mouth tightened. Mrs. Pike, send for the housekeeper. Mr. Vale as well. Every chamber recently assigned to her Grace is to be searched. Elinor stood then. Her knees did not shake, her voice did not rise. Yet the candles nearest her trembled in their silver cups, as though the house itself had taken notice. You may search my rooms, Your Grace, she said, but if you find what was planted there, you will have proved only that your servants know their way about your wife's chamber. Selene's fan snapped open. This is monstrous. No, Elinor said. It is familiar. Ashbourne looked at her for the first time as if she had struck him across the face. Enough, he said. The door burst wide. Henrietta ran into the dining room in her white muslin dress, hair loose over one shoulder, cheeks flushed with terror and cold. In both arms she carried a long velvet box, dark blue and stamped with the Ashbourne crest. Mrs. Pike made a strangled sound. Selene's fan stopped moving. Henrietta stumbled to Elinor's side and held the box out with shaking hands. It was in Lady Selene's wardrobe, the child said, behind Mamma's mourning shawl. The velvet box looked heavier in Henrietta's arms than any crown ought to look upon a child. No one moved while she held it out. The Ashbourne crest caught the candlelight, 3 black birds stamped in worn gold upon dark blue velvet, and the silence around the table became so complete that Elinor heard wax dripping into a silver socket. Lady Selene recovered first. That child has been coached, she said. Henrietta shrank against Elinor's skirt, but Elinor laid one hand lightly upon her shoulder. The little bones beneath her palm were sharp as bird wings. By whom? Elinor asked. Selene's eyes flashed. By you, naturally. Ashbourne came down the length of the table. He took the box from Henrietta, opened it, and revealed the pearl coronet resting inside upon faded satin. Its pearls were not bright like Selene's new necklace. They held an old, soft luster, cream touched with grey, the sort of beauty that had belonged to dead brides and painted ancestors. Where exactly did you find this? He asked his daughter. Henrietta's lips parted, but Mrs. Pike stepped forward. Your Grace. She's often confused after distress. She creeps into rooms, takes things, hides them, then invents fancies. The child's fingers curled into Elinor's gown. Elinor looked at Ashbourne. Ask Lady Selene to open her wardrobe. Lady Selene laughed once. How coarse. The Duke's hand closed over the lid of the coronet box. This will not be discussed before guests. There it was, the old commandment of great houses. Truth must wait until rank had left the room. Elinor saw the decision form before he spoke it. No scandal tonight. No accusation. No servant questioned where guests might hear. Selene would be protected by propriety, Mrs. Pike by habit, Mr. Vale by accounts no duke had read, and Henrietta would be carried back to the nursery. As if truth were a fever to be cooled, the door was locked long before anyone turned the key. Elinor lowered her hand from Henrietta's shoulder. As your Grace wishes. Selene's smile returned, faint and poisonous, but Elinor had no intention of fighting in a room chosen by her enemy. At dawn, she sent for writing paper, black wax, and the household seal. The footman who brought them stared when she asked for the full list of carriages available, then bowed when she repeated the order in the tone a duchess was expected to possess before anyone respected it. By breakfast, 6 notes had been written in the proper third person. Her Grace the Duchess of Ashbourne requests the presence of Mr. Anstruther of Lincoln's Inn at dinner this evening upon a matter of estate settlement. Another went to Lord Pemberton and the Viscountess with the diamonds, whose appetite for humiliation would draw them faster than courtesy. Another went to Mr. Vale. That one contained no request. You will attend. 2 footmen were sent to Eastmere and the lower tenant lane with plain invitations for Tom Bell and the widow who held Marianne's charity voucher. Elinor included a coin for each hired cart because poor people could not travel for noble justice on empty stomachs. A shilling in a cottage could mean bread, candles, and silence purchased for one more day. She meant to buy speech instead. At noon, a reply arrived from Mr. Anstruther. His letter remained unopened on Elinor's desk for nearly an hour while she stood beside the window and watched Mr. Vale cross the courtyard below. The steward looked up once toward her chamber, then spoke sharply to a groom and vanished into the stable arch. When Elinor finally broke the seal, the solicitor's hand was brisk and dry. I shall attend. The late Duchess's unfinished letter reached me too late once before. It shall not do so twice. Elinor placed Marianne's note, the nursery account book, the copied rent receipts, the silver button, and the apothecary entries inside the escritoire. She locked it and tied the key beneath the cuff of her sleeve. Near 4 o'clock, Lady Selene entered without invitation. She wore pale blue, the colour of innocence selected with malice. Her pearls had been replaced by garnets. "How industrious you have been," Selene said, glancing at the sealed notes upon the desk. "One might almost think you expected to govern. One might. You are forgetting yourself." "No," Elinor said, closing the escritoire drawer. "I am remembering everything." Selene stepped closer. Her perfume was roses and ambergris, too sweet for the cold room. "Ashbourne despises disorder. If you force him to choose between peace and you, my dear, do be certain you can survive the answer." Elinor looked at the woman who had laughed at her, frightened a child, and written initials beside stolen money. "Attend dinner." Selene's smile thinned. With pleasure. By evening, Ashbourne Hall had dressed itself for judgment without knowing it. Fires roared, silver shone. Servants moved quickly, frightened by the unusual number of places laid. In the corridor outside the dining room, Ashbourne stopped Elinor with one hand upon the door. His voice was low enough that only she could hear. "If you shame this house tonight, madam, you will not remain in it." The dining room smelled of roasted venison, hot wine, and thunder trapped in stone. Rain battered the windows behind the velvet curtains, and every candle on the table burned too steadily, as though even the flames feared to. Elinor entered on Ashbourne's arm, though his hand beneath hers had gone hard as carved oak. At the far end of the table, Lady Selene lifted her chin with the calm of a woman who believed rank, beauty, and a man's silence would always stand between her and consequence. Mr. Anstruther sat 2 places below Lord Pemberton, dry and spare in his black coat, a sealed leather case at his feet. Mr. Vale, the steward, had been placed near the sideboard, where the servants could see him, and he could not leave without crossing the room. Tom Bell sat stiffly in borrowed Sunday clothes, his cap crushed beneath his chair. The widow from the lower lane kept both hands folded around Marianne's charity voucher as if it were a holy relic. Lady Selene looked over the gathering and smiled. "How generous, Your Grace," she said to Elinor. "You have made a family dinner into a parish meeting." A few guests laughed because habit was easier than courage. Elinor took her seat. "No, Lady Selene, I have made it into an accounting." The Duke's gaze cut toward her, warning still alive in it. Elinor laid a silver-bound ledger beside her plate. The room noticed at once. It was an old estate book, its corners worn, its clasp tarnished, its pages swollen from years of damp fingers and careless ink. It had been made for counting candles, coal, rents, linen and wages. No one had expected it to count sins. Selene's fan opened. How tiresome. Must we discuss household ink over dinner? We must, Elinor said. Because household ink has fed some people and starved others. Mr. Vale rose halfway. Your Grace, with respect. Sit down, Ashbourne said. The steward sat. Elinor opened the ledger. The paper crackled beneath her hand. On the 10th of October, 2 years past, £3.08 were charged for nursery coal. Henrietta's nursery received none. On the 13th, laudanum was ordered in her name. The apothecary's bill shows 6 drams. The nursery record shows no physician called. Mrs. Pike, standing behind the servants, turned pale. Elinor looked down the table. A child was drugged to make her quiet. No one laughed, not this time. She turned another page. On the 21st, £5 were paid from the late Duchess's charity allowance to Widow Cresswell. Widow Cresswell, will you show what you received? The widow lifted her trembling hand. £2, Your Grace. The account says 5. Mr. Anstruther leaned forward. The late Duchess placed that charity under written instruction. Any diversion required a signed voucher. Elinor held one up. Here is the voucher. Selene's fan moved faster. Elinor placed another paper beside it. And here is Lady Marianne's unfinished letter to you, sir, warning that those funds were being diverted before her death. Ashbourne's chair creaked beneath him. Elinor did not look at him. Not yet. She turned the ledger so the candlelight fell upon the margins. After Lady Marianne died, payments continued to be made under her private instruction. Carriage hire to Bath. Nurse's discretion. Pearls reset. Cash, no receipt. The dead Duchess gave many orders after she had been laid in the family vault. Lady Selene stood. This is vulgar. No, Elinor said. It is arithmetic. Mr. Anstruther opened his leather case and drew out a smaller book. The clerk at the Bath jeweller's confirmed a pearl necklace purchased 6 weeks ago in a lady's name and paid through an Ashbourne household draft. The draft bore initials authorizing private disbursement. Elinor turned the ledger toward the Duke. At the bottom of the largest payments, in narrow elegant strokes, appeared the same mark again and again, SM. The Duke stared at the initials as if the ink had begun to bleed. Selene stepped back from the table. Ashbourne, you cannot permit this creature to accuse me before tenants. Tom Bell rose so quickly, his chair struck the floor. A man in your ladyship's service threatened me over rent. Mr. Vale lunged to his feet. Lies. Elinor reached into her reticule and set the silver button upon the table. It rolled once, then stopped beneath the Duke's hand. The Ashbourne crest gleamed upward. Selene turned toward the door. Henrietta moved first. No one had seen the child leave her place beside the hearth. She climbed onto her chair, small and barefoot beneath her muslin hem, holding the pearl coronet with both hands. The old pearls trembled as she lifted them, but her voice did not. She placed the late Duchess's coronet upon Elinor's head. Now, Henrietta said, facing the whole room, they must call you Duchess. For a moment, the coronet changed the air in the room. It did not glitter loudly. Its pearls held the candlelight in a low, mournful glow, like moonlight caught in milk. Upon Elinor's plain dark hair, the late Duchess's jewel looked less like an ornament than a verdict. Around the table, forks lay abandoned. Wine stood untouched, and even the rain against the windows seemed to soften so it could listen. Henrietta remained standing on the chair, both hands still raised, though the coronet had left them. Her small chest moved fast beneath her muslin bodice. She looked not at Lady Selene, nor at the guests, but at her father. Ashbourne had gone white, not pale from anger, not pale from wounded pride, white as ash beneath a dying grate. Henrietta, he said. The child lowered her arms slowly. You never asked me. The words struck harder than accusation. Ashbourne gripped the back of a chair. The silver button lay beneath his other hand. The ledger stood open beside it. Marianne's unfinished letter rested near his wineglass, the inked plea of a wife who had tried to protect her child and had been called fanciful for the effort. Lady Selene reached the door. Mr. Anstruther stepped into her path with the calm discourtesy of a solicitor who knew precisely how much scandal a room could hold before it spilled into law. Lady March, I would advise you to remain. You advise me? She said. I do. Certain questions may shortly be put before a magistrate, and flight does not improve a lady's position. A bitter sound left Selene's throat. This is absurd. Servants steal, tenants lie. Children imagine things, and plain wives grow ambitious when men pity them. Elinor's fingers touched the edge of the table, not to steady herself but to feel the wood, hard and real, beneath her hand. She had endured laughter, she had endured mud, cold corridors, and doors listened behind. Now the room had no soft corner left for lies to hide. Mr. Vale moved as if to reach the side door. Tom Bell caught his sleeve, the steward twisted round. Take your hand from me. You put your hand on my door first, Tom said. You'll stand where Her Grace put you. A footman near the sideboard swallowed, then stepped closer to the steward. Another followed. Household servants lived and died by written characters, those formal references without which a dismissed servant might never find another place. To stand against a steward could cost a man bread for life. Yet two more footmen shifted, blocking the way. Mrs. Pike began to weep in small, dry gasps. I was told it was for the child's nerves. Lady March said the drops were proper. Henrietta climbed down from the chair. The Duke turned toward her, one hand half extended, then stopped when the child stepped behind Elinor's skirts. That stopped him completely. A sealed letter was carried in by the butler then, his face rigid with dread. Your Grace, from the bank, marked urgent. Ashbourne broke it with fingers that fumbled for the first time that evening. His eyes moved across the page. Elinor watched the final mask fall from his face. What is it? Lord Pemberton asked, unable to resist. Ashbourne looked at Selene. A household draft was presented this morning for a second payment against jewels purchased in Bath, signed under my authority. Selene's mouth opened. No answer came. The Duke lowered the letter. How long? No one asked what he meant. The room understood. Elinor answered because no one else would. Since before Lady Marianne died, I think, worse after. Quicker after you stopped looking. Ashbourne flinched. Then his eyes moved to Henrietta's bare feet, to the child's thin wrists, to the place where she clutched Elinor's gown, as if the woman mocked as borrowed silk had become the only safe thing in Ashbourne Hall. He went to his knees. A sound broke through the room, half gasp, half disbelief. Dukes did not kneel before wives in dining rooms. They bowed to sovereigns, not to women they had purchased through settlements and left to bleed quietly beneath courtesy. Ashbourne bowed his head before Elinor. I wronged you, he said, his voice rough enough to scrape. I brought you here as a convenience. I let this table laugh at you. I let her speak where I should have silenced her. I ignored my daughter because grief made me a coward and pride made me blind. He lifted his eyes, and the shame in them had no elegance left. Elinor, I ask your pardon. The pearls upon her head felt cold against her scalp. Elinor looked down at the man whose name had not protected her, whose silence had harmed a child, whose house had become a hunting ground for polished thieves. Then she removed neither her hand from Henrietta nor the coronet from her head. Rise, Your Grace, she said. A public apology is not the same as a changed man. Frost silvered the front steps of Ashbourne Hall before the sun had the courage to rise. By morning, the great house had changed its breathing. Doors closed softly now. Servants who had once looked through Elinor began stepping aside for her with lowered eyes. Not in mockery, but in calculation and fear. In the library the fire had been built high, yet the room smelled of cold ashes, sealing wax, damp wool, and the sharp ink Mr. Anstruther used as he copied figures from the silver-bound ledger. Lady Selene sat near the window with her gloves still on. She had not been permitted to leave in the night. Ashbourne stood by the mantel, one arm braced against the marble, watching the solicitor sort vouchers, drafts, pawn records, rent receipts, and Marianne's unfinished letter into neat accusing piles. Mr. Vale, the steward, stood between two footmen at the door. His face had the yellow look of a man who had spent the night meeting the future and finding no chair offered to him. Mr. Anstruther tapped one paper with his spectacles. The Bath jeweller confirms 2 payments. The bank confirms a household draft. The initials on the authorization match the entries in the nursery and charity accounts. Lady March, you may deny the hand, but you will find denial expensive. Selene laughed without warmth. A solicitor's little theatre does not frighten me. It should, Elinor said. The room went still enough for the fire to crack loudly. Selene turned her head. You have enjoyed this, haven't you? Elinor looked at the woman's perfect hair, her pale gloves, the garnet at her throat. No, enjoyment would have required less damage. Mr. Vale stepped forward. Your Grace, I served your father. I served you. I made small corrections, nothing more. Estate accounts are not nursery sums to be understood by ladies. Ashbourne turned at last. You threatened tenants in my livery. The steward's jaw worked. They were behind. They were robbed. Mr. Anstruther lifted the silver button from the desk. And there are witnesses. A low sound came from the corridor beyond the library door. Wheels over gravel, another carriage arriving. Lord Pemberton and the Viscountess had not gone. Others from the night before had remained beneath Ashbourne's roof, trapped by weather and curiosity, and now they gathered like crows at the windows, eager to see whether disgrace wore silk or servants' black. The butler entered with an unopened letter upon a tray. From the magistrate, Your Grace. Ashbourne did not touch it. He looked first at Elinor. She gave the smallest nod. Only then did he break the seal. Mr. Vale's knees loosened visibly when the Duke finished reading. In service, a man's written character was bread itself. Without a respectable reference, no great house would take him, no steward's room would open, no master would trust him near a rent roll again. Dismissal was punishment. Dismissal without character was a kind of burial. Ashbourne folded the letter. Mr. Vale, you are dismissed from my service. Your books, keys and papers remain here. You will be escorted to the magistrate after breakfast. The steward lunged half a step. Your Grace. No, one word cut him down. Mrs. Pike fared no better. She confessed before noon, naming Selene's instructions, the bitter milk, the hidden coronet, the threats spoken through servants' mouths. Her cap shook in her hands as she begged for mercy, but Elinor thought of Henrietta's bare feet on cold marble and did not look away. By afternoon, restitution had begun. Coins were counted openly upon the library table. Tom Bell received the stolen portion of his rent with both hands and stared at the money as if it might vanish if he breathed too hard. Widow Cresswell wept over £3 returned from Marianne's charity fund. The apothecary's false bills were marked for inquiry. Every name Elinor had copied in the lower lanes was read aloud, and every debt falsely swollen was struck through in red ink. At 4 o'clock, Lady Selene's carriage was brought round. The frost had not melted from the steps. She descended them with her chin lifted, though disgrace followed so closely it almost brushed her hem. The guests watched from the portico and windows. No one offered an arm. No one called her dear. Her trunks had been searched, her letters sealed, her accounts placed in Mr. Anstruther's leather case. At the carriage door, Selene turned back. You think a coronet makes you safe, she said. Elinor stood above her on the steps, Henrietta's hand tucked into her own. No, it only made you careless, for once. Selene had no beautiful answer. The carriage rolled away, wheels crushing frost into dirty lines along the drive. Inside the house, servants began moving differently, as if the walls had been relieved of a weight. Yet victory did not warm Elinor's hands. That evening, Ashbourne came to her in the library. He carried a heavy iron ring threaded with the master keys of Ashbourne Hall, storerooms, linen press, wine cellar, jewel press, nursery cupboards, household desk. The authority of every locked room hung from his hand. Elinor, he said quietly, these should have been yours from the first. He held them out. She looked at the keys, but she did not take them at once. The master keys stayed between them long enough for the fire to burn one log into red collapse. Elinor looked at the iron ring in Ashbourne's hand, at the labels tied to each key in neat brown ink, and at the man who had finally understood that authority was not a gift when it arrived after injury. Outside the library windows, frost silvered the lawn. Inside, the house waited. Ashbourne lowered his hand. You will not take them. I will, Elinor said, but not as an apology. His fingers closed once around the keys. Then as what? As my right. She stepped forward and took the ring from him. The iron was cold and heavy enough to pull at her wrist, and as a promise that every locked room in this house is finished being used against a child, a tenant, or a woman without witnesses. Ashbourne bowed his head. Then I shall begin there. He did not ask what he must do to be forgiven. That would have been too easy. Instead, the next morning, he rode to Eastmere without a groom and stood in Tom Bell's cottage with his hat in his hands while the tenant's lambing shed was repaired at the Duke's expense. He ordered no speech written for him. He brought no audience. He listened while men who had once tugged forelocks in fear named every rent swollen by Mr. Vale's hand. By the first thaw, the estate office smelled of new paper, sanded ink, and pine from shelves built to hold proper accounts. Elinor sat at the desk every Tuesday and Friday, with the steward's great ledger open and the new agent standing beside it. She learned which fields flooded, which widows needed coal, which cottages owed money because they were idle, and which owed because the harvest had failed. Quarter days no longer passed like traps. At Lady Day, when rents were due and many poor families counted shillings by candle end, Elinor had the receipts written twice, one for the estate, one for the tenant's own hand. Plain paper prevents handsome lies, she told the new agent. He dipped his pen. Yes, Your Grace. Henrietta no longer ate alone in the nursery. At first, she came to breakfast clutching her doll so tightly that the porcelain face pressed marks into her palm. She sat beside Elinor and waited for someone to send her away. No one did. Ashbourne himself drew out her chair, awkwardly the first morning, better the second, and by the end of the week he had learned that his daughter preferred honey on toast but hated marmalade, because Mrs. Pike had once used it to hide bitter drops. The day he discovered that his knife stopped in the butter, Henrietta watched his hand. He placed the knife down carefully. There will be no bitter drops in this house again. Even if I cry, she asked. Especially then. The child looked at Elinor before she believed him. Trust was not a ribbon to be tied back. It was a torn thing, mended one stitch at a time. In March, an unopened letter arrived from Lady Beatrice Vale. Elinor recognized her aunt's narrow hand before the butler had crossed half the breakfast room. The old Elinor might have broken the seal at once, hungry for approval from the woman who had traded her into rank. The Duchess of Ashbourne set it beside her plate and continued cutting Henrietta's toast. Ashbourne noticed. "Will you read it?" "When I have an appetite for vinegar," Elinor said. A small sound came from Henrietta, a laugh. It was quick, startled, and bright enough to turn Ashbourne's face toward her as if a window had opened in a locked room. He did not reach for the moment too greedily. He only smiled into his coffee and let the child keep it. By spring, Ashbourne Hall no longer held its breath when Elinor entered a room. The housekeeper brought her household books without being summoned twice. The new nurse kept the nursery cupboards unlocked. The tenants bowed lower, but with less fear. The jewel press remained in Elinor's keeping, though the pearl coronet stayed wrapped in black velvet, not because she rejected it, but because she had nothing left to prove to old pearls. Ashbourne changed in quieter ways. He walked with Henrietta after supper. He learned to knock before entering Elinor's sitting room. When London papers mentioned Lady Selene March's sudden departure for a widowed aunt in Devon, he folded the sheet and placed it in the fire without comment. When Elinor disagreed with him at the estate table, he listened before speaking. One evening, while rain softened the gravel outside, he said, "I have begun to admire you." Elinor looked up from the account book. "Admiration is safer than love, Your Grace, and less than you are owed." She closed the ledger, but not the distance between them. "Then continue with honesty. We shall see what it becomes." By the time of the spring assembly, half the county knew the story and pretended not to. The room was bright with flowers, candle wax, and damp silk drying near the walls. Elinor entered with Henrietta at one side and Ashbourne at the other, wearing no coronet, only a gown of deep blue and the keys of Ashbourne Hall hidden beneath her glove. The Viscountess with the shaking diamonds saw her first. Then Lord Pemberton bowed, and, before the first violin note rose, The same ladies who had laughed lowered their curtsies first. The dining room held its breath around the open ledger. Rain struck the windows behind the curtains, and the candles trembled in their silver branches, throwing long, wavering shadows over the faces that had once bent toward Elinor's humiliation, as if it were supper entertainment. The same mouths that had laughed at the governess in borrowed silk were now closed. The same hands that had lifted crystal to toast her discomfort rested pale and motionless beside untouched plates. Elinor stood at the foot of the table, with the silver-bound ledger open beneath her fingers. Lady Selene stood near the door. Between them lay every stolen shilling, every false receipt, every quiet cruelty dressed in household ink. Ashbourne's voice came low from the head of the table. Continue. The word was not command enough to own her. It was permission too late to matter. Elinor turned a page. On the 3rd of November, 2 years past, £4 were charged to the late Duchess Marianne's private charity for coal sent to widow Cresswell. Seated stiffly near Mr. Anstruther, lifted her chin. Her black gloves were worn white at the fingertips. I received 1 sack, she said. Not £4 worth, not near. Elinor placed the woman's signed receipt beside the ledger. The remaining sum was marked as paid out under private instruction. Mr. Anstruther leaned forward, his spectacles catching the firelight. A dead woman cannot give private instructions. A murmur ran down the table. Lady Selene's smile had thinned to nothing. This is vulgar beyond endurance. No, Elinor said. Vulgarity was laughing at a child's mother after stealing from her grave. The room stilled. Henrietta sat beside the hearth in a small chair Elinor had ordered brought down from the nursery. Her doll rested in her lap, the mended seam hidden beneath the muslin gown. She had not spoken since dinner began. Her bare feet were covered now in knitted slippers, but she kept them tucked beneath the chair, as if expecting the cold marble to return. Elinor opened another paper. The apothecary's bill records laudanum supplied to the nursery. Mrs. Pike admitted. It was mixed into milk when Lady Henrietta cried at night. Ashbourne's hand closed around the stem of his glass until the crystal gave a small, warning sound. Mrs. Pike, standing near the sideboard, pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. I was told it was kindness, Your Grace. Lady March said the child's nerves would ruin the household. Henrietta looked at her father, not pleading, not accusing, only waiting. That waiting broke something in him more surely than tears would have done. Selene took 1 step toward the door. You cannot keep me here to listen to servants and tenants perform grief. Mr. Anstruther moved first, placing himself between Selene and the threshold. You will remain, my lady. The matter has gone beyond drawing-room insult. Lord Pemberton cleared his throat. Surely, Ashbourne, there must be some private way. There was a private way, Elinor said, and lifted Marianne's unfinished letter. Lady Marianne tried it. Her letter to Mr. Anstruther was never sent. Her concerns were called fancies. Her child was called difficult. Her accounts were turned into a purse for thieves. She placed the letter before the Duke. He stared at his late wife's hand, at the line where the ink had dragged and stopped. Elinor then took the small silver button from her reticule and set it upon the polished table. It rolled once, then settled beneath the light. The Ashbourne crest shone upward. Tom Bell rose from his chair, rough hands gripping the chair back. That came from the man who threatened my house, Your Grace. Said we'd be turned out before lambing if we spoke of rent. Mr. Vale, the steward, shoved back from the table. A tenant's word against mine? No, Elinor said. A tenant's word, a widow's receipt, a chiseled hidden note, an apothecary's bill, a jeweller's draft, and your own ledger. She turned the final page. The room seemed to lean toward it. In narrow, elegant strokes beside the largest payments were the initials that had followed Elinor through every cupboard, every rent roll, every warning. SM. Lady Selene's face hardened. Those letters prove nothing. They prove pattern, Mr. Anstruther said. The bank's urgent note proves payment. The jeweller's book proves purchase. Mrs. Pike's confession proves conspiracy. The magistrate will not find it nothing. Selene turned to Ashbourne, beautiful even in ruin. You would let her do this? This plain little wife bought with a settlement. You would let her shame you before the county. Ashbourne rose slowly. For the first time since Elinor had entered his house, his silence did not protect the wrong person. You shamed my house, he said. She saved it. Selene recoiled as if struck. At that moment, Henrietta climbed down from her chair. No one stopped her. She walked to the sideboard, opened the velvet box with both hands, and lifted the late Duchess's pearl coronet. The old pearls trembled in the candlelight, cream and grey, softer than Selene's new jewels, and far more terrible. Henrietta carried it to Elinor. The room watched the child, who had once been kept from dinner, step into the very centre of the room. Elinor bent, not to receive a crown, but to meet Henrietta's eyes. The child placed the coronet upon Elinor's dark hair. Her fingers shook, yet she finished the task with solemn care. Then she turned to the table where the ton had laughed on that first night. Now, Henrietta said, her voice thin but clear, they must call you Duchess. No one laughed. Not this time. The Viscountess lowered her gaze. Lord Pemberton rose halfway and bowed. One by one, chairs scraped softly as guests stood, not from affection, but from the old instinct of rank bending before authority it could no longer deny. Ashbourne looked from the coronet to his daughter's hand in Elinor's. His face altered by degrees, as if every ignored cry, every sealed account, every silent meal had returned to stand before him. Then he came around the table. Dukes did not kneel in dining rooms. They did not lower themselves before wives purchased through marriage contracts. They did not ask pardon with tenants watching and servants listening. Ashbourne sank to one knee before Elinor and Henrietta. I let them laugh, he said. His voice was rough, stripped of polish. I let her wound you because it was easier than admitting I had brought rot into my own house. I let my daughter grieve alone because grief made a coward of me. Elinor, I ask your pardon. Henrietta, I ask yours too. Henrietta's fingers tightened around Elinor's. Elinor looked down at the man who had once warned her that if she shamed his house, she would not remain in it. I did not shame Ashbourne, she said. I opened its windows. Ashbourne bowed his head. Elinor did not offer her hand. Rise, your grace, she said. A public apology is not the same as a changed man. By morning, frost covered the steps of Ashbourne Hall, and disgrace had become visible. Lady Selene's trunks were brought down under the eyes of the same guests who had once admired her. Mr. Anstruther carried away the jeweller's papers, the bank drafts, and the marked accounts in his leather case. Mr. Vale was dismissed without character, a sentence every servant in the house understood. Mrs. Pike was removed from the nursery before breakfast, and the bitter drops were locked away for the apothecary to answer. Coins were counted in the library, not whispered over in back rooms. Tom Bell received the stolen portion of his rent. Widow Cresswell received the charity money Marianne had intended for her. False debts were struck through in red ink, and the new estate agents signed each correction before witnesses. When Selene reached her carriage, the frost cracked beneath her shoes. She looked up at Elinor on the steps. You think they love you now? Elinor held Henrietta's hand. No, I think they have learned to count. The carriage door shut. Wheels ground over the frozen drive, and Lady Selene March left Ashbourne with no gentleman at the window and no woman calling farewell. Months passed before peace dared to feel ordinary. Elinor governed the house openly. The master keys hung at her waist when she walked the storerooms, the linen press, the nursery cupboards, and the estate office. At Lady Day, when rents were due, each tenant received a written receipt in his own hand, as well as in the estate book. Because Elinor had learned that plain paper could prevent handsome lies, Henrietta dined downstairs every evening. At first, the child sat close to Elinor, one hand on her doll and one eye on the door. Then she learned to ask for honey, to refuse bitter milk, to laugh without glancing at the corridor. Ashbourne learned more slowly. He knocked before entering rooms. He listened when Elinor spoke over ledgers. He visited tenants without an audience, and returned with mud on his boots and fewer speeches in his mouth. Respect came first. Whatever gentler thing might grow from, it would have to earn its place. On the night of the spring assembly, The ladies, who had laughed, lowered their curtsies before Elinor had crossed the room. She wore no coronet. The pearl circlet remained locked away, wrapped in velvet, no longer needed to prove what everyone in Ashbourne Hall already knew. Later at home, Elinor stood at the head of the dinner table, with Henrietta's hand in hers. The fire gave off the warm scent of applewood. Silver shone. Bread steamed beneath white linen. No one in the room mistook silence for peace any longer. Ashbourne rose and lifted his glass. "To her grace," he said, his voice steady across the candlelight, "the only woman who ever saved Ashbourne." Thank you for watching this complete story. Elinor's journey was about more than becoming a duchess. It was about a woman who was laughed at, underestimated, and still chose truth over silence. If this story pulled you into the world of betrayal, courage, and hard-won respect, please like the video so the algorithm can help more historical romance lovers find it. Share it with someone who enjoys dukes, duchesses, revenge, redemption, and fierce heroines who refuse to be broken. Subscribe and turn on notifications for the next full historical romance story. And tell me in the comments, did Ashbourne deserve a second chance, or should Elinor have kept only the house and the child?